So we start.
Hello and welcome to the current episode of Unboxing Russia. My name is Pradnya, and together with Ekaterina Schulmann, we will talk about everything and anything that's Russian or Indian. But before we get into the conversation, a heartfelt thank you to everyone who was very creative and suggested names for our potential show for cooking and politics. Did you have a favorite?
I read this comment section with enjoyment, which is not a thing you often encounter on YouTube, but generally in my videos, the commentators are the best and most polite and knowledgeable all over the internet, incomparable in this respect. But that was particularly fun to read because people were coming up with titles. So my personal favorite was cucumber chutney. Which is a combination of an Indian dish and that most Russian of vegetables, the sacred vegetable of Russia. Maybe only cabbage can rival it as the staple of Russian cuisine. So you eat cucumbers raw, you salt them, you marinate them, you put them in soups, etc. Generally, Russians and, well, Slavic people in general complain that you can't get proper cucumbers in Germany. You can get those overgrown yellowish ones, which they stew, using them like they were zucchini or something. Or you can get those very small
snack cucumbers.
Yes, and over sweet ones. They are called Persian cucumbers for some reason, and they come from Iran. But that's not the thing we call cucumbers. Our cucumbers, they need to be pickly, and sometimes they even have little needles, and they have to be green, and they need to have a crunch. And they don't have to be so expensive because here they're like exotic fruits. So this conversation will be totally devoted to cucumbers. No, not really. I'm just explaining the reasons why I like that title so much. So what did you prefer?
I loved the in the soup because, more than often we are actually in the soup trying
Absolutely.
to figure out what this could mean or if this could mean something. And sometimes there's no answer to it, so we're literally in a soup.
Yes, and we are in a position where we are both culinary critics and ingredients, which again is a peculiar situation to find oneself in. And this is actually what we're going to talk about now, not now that we're starting to talk in good earnest. Yesterday, we were both participants in a public discussion hosted by the Robert Bosch Academy here in Berlin, and it was devoted to various understandings of democracy. Pradnya here was the highly skilled moderator. I was one of the speakers, and the other two speakers represented United States
And West Africa.
and West Africa, Ghana. And with three speakers and just an hour and a half of time, I was initially kind of afraid that we will each talk about our peculiar continent, which is a big one in every case and full of troubles of various kinds. So there will be no unity in the conversation. And again, initially, the American participant talked about
Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook.
Yes, she talked about Donald Trump and the oncoming elections and the attempts to subvert democratic institutions from the inside. And the speaker from Ghana,
Kwasi
yes,
Prempeh.
yeah, whom I had the pleasure to meet previously, and we discussed the necessity of democratic constitutional reforms and whether you can write such a constitution that will, if not guarantee you a smooth democratization transfer, at least make authoritarian backsliding more difficult or more lengthy. If you can't make it difficult, at least prolong the process. So he talked about how people in Africa understood democracy as something that will bring them not just ability to participate in decision making, but also Western levels consumption lifestyle. And when that didn't materialize, and when this democratization was instead coupled with privatization of property, sounds familiar to the Russian ears, the state ceding its social obligations, actual chaotization of previous social structures when they were very naturally disappointed with this whole democracy thing. Again, this sounds eerily familiar to Russian audience, but also the fact that despite all that, still the majority of respondents, when you look at the polls, when you look at value survey, think that democracy is better than the absence thereof. They still think democracy is a good thing, but they have a rather different understanding of what democracy is. Sometimes they understand democracy as the state being socially responsible towards the people. Or they understand democracy as a tool that will help them lower the glaring inequalities that are the curse of poor societies. There occurs generally not just inequalities, but perceived inequalities. When people see that not just they are poor and everyone else around is poor, but somebody very close to them suddenly getting rich. And what makes it worse, becoming rich because they occupy a certain state position, because they have a rank, because they have a place in a bureaucratic hierarchy. And that makes people dissatisfied with this state of things. And they think that democracy will be something to, again, lower this inequality level. But coming back to my fears of the conversation taking 3 different turns, not just in the end, but actually in the middle of it, thanks to the art of the moderator, we discovered that we understand democracy in a broadly similar frame as something that is not a state of things, but an ongoing process. So democracy is high maintenance, not in a sense that it's expensive or affordable only to the richer societies, but it is not something that you can do once and forever, no more than you can wash your hands once and forever, or cook a pot of soup to feed your family once and forever. You need to keep doing this. And
it's like being in a relationship.
It's like
it takes work.
Yes, it's like being in a relationship. It's like being a parent. It's like doing whatever. It's like getting an education. You can't just get an education and then live on the proceeds your whole life. You need to constantly educate
like you could,
yourself.
but it comes with a consequence.
You could, but really you couldn't. It wouldn't pay off. So democracy is not something that you can install. And what is absolutely crucial to understand when you have your democratization process for the first time, or even for the second time, if you get the second chance, is that you can't just democratically elect the good guys and then hug yourself and congratulate yourself on having established a democratic political regime. So you need to repeat the process again and again.
That's the commonality that you brought up, that you discovered. But at the same time, it was also quite interesting to see that the expectation that people have when they choose a democratic setup over anything else is very different. So in the West African context, for instance, or as you also mentioned in the Russian context, for instance, there is an expectation from a democratic system to be a force of equalizing. You know, people expect democratic institutions to ensure that the glaring inequalities in the society are addressed, and it kind of works as a equalizing mechanism in a society. At the same time, it's also different because in the United States, for instance, it's a very individualistic way of life. So how the social construct is in place. So in the US, when Kamala Harris talks about freedoms and not necessarily, her narrative is less about democracy, her narrative is more about freedom and having the freedom of choice to choose for yourself. And that is not something that would fly well in a West African context or in an Asian context, for instance, where the community feeling is more stronger. It's in the center of the day-to-day way of life. So the moment you say you as an individual have a choice to choose what you want for yourself, that's not a narrative that's going to fly. So I think it's the same story, but being told from so many different perspectives. So what we were trying to do is, we are aware that it's very different in whatever context you're looking at, but there still is a possibility of finding a common ground. Because right now, with so many discourses on democracy out there, I think that the challenge is to find a common ground, because everyone can have their own choices of democracy, if that is what it is, ranging from illiberal democracy or a sovereign democracy.
I tried to explain this concept to the unbelieving audiences.
So we have these multiple constructs of democracy, and then it's very easy to lose track.
Because it went straight to my heart when Kwasi talked about local self-government as the basis of democracy.
And that was another common feature.
That's so much my cup of tea.
So to put that in a nutshell, I think all the speakers agreed that more than often, most of the investment on democratic resilience goes into the federal level to ensure that the top brass is ensured, that you're making sure that the top guys are
democratically
and behave
yes.
themselves and don't get carried away. I'm not naming here anyone, but I'm just saying. But at the same time, one often forgets that the guys on the top can only sit at the top because the guys at the bottom are either powerless or have enough power to keep the guys on the top in check. So what you need to do is diversify your investments in democratic resilience and not put all your funds or your hedges on the guys at the top.
On the very top, yes. And this makes authoritarian backsliding, which is a thing that we see in various countries of the world, again, not pointing any fingers at anyone, but that makes authoritarian backsliding more costly and the process more lengthy. And in politics, time is an important factor. If you can subvert the system, if you can change it into something that monopolizes power at the very top quickly, then you can do it. And then you'll sit in power for the next 25 years. But if it's a step-by-step process that meets resistance, and not just resistance from heroic citizens who take to the streets, because that's really demanding too much of a self-sacrifice from a citizen, but it meets with resistance from empowered groups. For example, again, local self-government, municipalities, cities, rich and strong and empowered, regions and regional powers, then an autocrat or a budding autocrat or a dictator wannabe has a harder job of it, and hopefully he'll possibly step down before he completes his work. The two of us come from the countries that are experiencing different degrees, yes, different stages, but perhaps are experiencing stages of the same process, of this, if not dismantling of democratic institutions, but subversion of them, hollowing out of them, or just leaving them as a kind of window dressing behind which we see the same process of monopolization, of consolidation of power. And this is sold as a good thing for the country because a strong man can make strong decisions without bothering with this whole checks and balances thing. And decisions can be made quickly and then they can be implemented quickly, and all for the good of the country. But we see that speed in these cases is not actually a good thing. This subversion happens often, it is centered often in electoral institutions. We've been talking about the weirdness of Russian elections in quite a few of our conversations, but I understand that we've also been touching on the Indian elections. So you even did a little extra recording when the results of Indian parliamentary elections
came out.
I understand that something else is cooking there. So, could you please explain?
So, one nation, one election is the tagline, which necessarily means, so if you remember, I spoke about how the Indian elections is a very dragged out exercise, especially the national elections, which span over a 6 weeks time. Different states go to polls at different stages, and so on and so forth. And that is not to say that the state elections take place at a different time, because they are not in sync anymore. So now the current government, which was one of its electoral promises to kind of deliver on this promise of ensuring that the country doesn't find itself in a perpetual process of elections, because once the national elections are done in about a year's time, year and a half's time, some of the states starts going to elections, and then it's like a continuous state of being in election somewhere or the other. So that's the
and this is supposed to be a bad thing.
So it has its plus and minuses. So we can talk about that a little. So the current government a few days ago, on the 18th of September, started this deliberation on introducing these two bills to the parliament, and if the bill goes through, or they wanted to introduce a bill to the parliament,
and they have the majority.
No. So that's the interesting part. So they had assumed that they would have the majority when they made the electoral promise. If the bill goes through, it involves 2 constitutional amendments, which will ensure that we have one nation, one election. So all the national and the state level elections will be in sync, and which would also ensure that the local body elections will happen within a span of, which is the panchayat system in India, which is like a very local grassroots political body, and which will ensure that these elections, the other local elections, which are below the state, will happen within a span of 100 days after the central and the state level elections happen.
But the nation level elections will still go on for 6 weeks, or will they take place in less than number of days?
So I think it will be a lesser number of days if that goes through. But if they will phase it out to like one day, I don't think that's realistic, because it would also mean a massive infrastructural haul. But to be honest, I don't know what they want to do with that. If they want to do it in one day, or if they want to reduce the size or the time frame of the elections. That is something that we still need to see, or at least I need to see. But leaving the technicalities of it aside, I think there is this conversation around this one nation, one election thing. So the positive, or the proponents of this particular policy, have been saying that we need to do it for the reasons that I mentioned, that we don't want to have a country which is a vast country and with a lot of voters. We don't want to be in that perpetual state of being in an election mode, because then you have the code of conduct, so then you can't really pass through legislations, everything comes to a standstill, and then depending on which government comes into place, then they have to kind of build up their rapport with the federal government, and so on and so forth. So which is like a lot of time, huge time frame that we're looking at.
Do they want to introduce the all-nation election day, roughly speaking? Is that the idea?
What do you mean?
Like one day when elections, or 3 days when elections take place across the country.
So however that time frame is, so right now, from what I think could be done, is they will still stick to a slightly longer time frame, because like I said, to do all of that on one day it's a huge task. It's a mammoth task. What they will do, however, is that the state elections coincide with the national elections. So if one state is going to polls for the national elections, it will be the same day that they also go to poll for the state elections. What the critics of this entire exercise are saying is that if you do that, the federal government will not be held accountable for their failings, because that's usually how it works, right? If you fail on certain things, or if you've not delivered on certain things at a federal level, you pay for it in the state elections. You lose your mandates. And that kind of works in a way as a checks and balance kind of a system. So that's the downside of it. And there is also this fear that this is also like a way of consolidating power, because once you have someone at the top who is now there for 5 years, he's also got his people around on the ground. It could just mean that this person will then try to kind of get things done in the next 5 years, because everyone's in office. And at some point, you do have a little more power at the federal level than you would at the state level. So that's a presumption. But I also want to say that when this electoral promise came into the picture, the current ruling party, which is the BJP, had a lot of state governments. They were assuming that they will have a majority in a lot of states. And as the final polling results came out, they lost the majority in the lower house, which is the Lok Sabha.
Yeah, I remember.
So
you talked about it.
Yeah, so they don't have the majority they had hoped for in the states. So when they started out with it, the whole notion behind it was, let's consolidate power, because we don't know who will come after Mr. Modi. So let's stick to that, and then we'll see where it goes. So then, as long as we've managed to get control of the house or houses in one flash, in a one broad strike, state and federal, then all is good.
But you don't have term limits for a prime minister.
We don't, but Mr. Modi is not getting any younger.
How old is he, by the way?
he would be somewhere in his 70s. Of course,
that's a very average age for a political leader these days.
Yeah.
Is he supposed to be in good health?
He's in a very good health. He also does these videos where he's doing yoga and all of that.
Familiar.
So I don't think that's the case, but I think they also have to realistically consider the next step, because he's not going to be around forever. And that was the point of conversation where it was emerging from this whole conversation. Now the ruling party has this challenge that they have to secure consensus on this first in the lower house, then in the upper house, and only then it will be passed. And if that is passed, it would mean, if the bill goes through, and assuming that the bill is in the amendments and everything is in place by next year, so whichever state goes to state elections next year will have a capped term which will end in 2029, because the current National Assembly or the National Parliament, the lower house, the legislature period is from 2024 till 2029.
5 years.
5 years. So the state elections, which also have a term of 5 years, would not go for the term would not be for 5 but for 4. Ensuring that in 2029
you can have this again all national
you can kind of roll out
day.
Exactly,
and re-elect everybody
exactly
at once.
And whatever states go to elections in the years after, then we'll have increasingly shorter terms, because you need to make sure that it coincides.
I see.
So that's again a humongous task that you need to kind of address. But like I said, I think it's something that we have to watch out.
Yes,
what will happen.
A lot of it sounds familiar. In Russia, we have had the unified electoral day introduced some years ago. It was twice a year, and now it's just once in September. So there was this recent wave of elections and re-elections in the beginning of September of this year. And that was also introduced under the pretext, or with the explanation that it will be more comfortable for the voters and more convenient for the system itself. And since then, we Russians have come to be very wary of changes that are introduced within this frame. Like, it's more comfortable or it's less costly. For some reason, democratic institutions are always described as costly. Like, why should we have so many MPs? Or why should we pay them salary? Let them just, visit the regional legislative assembly twice every month to vote. They don't need to be there the whole time. Then the budget will have less to pay. But it is never the conversation that, for example, the executive is too expensive, or if you try to say that the war is too expensive, that is in the criminal code. That is a crime. How is it? Discrimination of the military forces. But elections and elected bodies are always described as some sort of drag on the national resources. And that we have come to recognize as a dangerous sign. Generally, having one and only election day is favorable to the stronger parties who can have enough resources to carry various level campaigns at the same time. But for smaller parties, for aspiring political groups, for those who are in the opposition, not yet in power, this is a disadvantage, because they could collect enough manpower and money to have one campaign, for example, on the regional level, but they can't do the whole vertical of it. And in terms of possible falsifications, I understand this is not yet an issue in India, so you don't have those nationwide scandals when you discover.
Not anymore. We used to have.
Used to.
Because we switched to the electronic voting machine, right? So that is a different level of safeguarding. So you don't have people physically running away with ballot boxes and just replacing an entire ballot.
So you have those electronic
voting
boxes
machines.
where you put your ballot. Yeah, we used to have that too, but now they're being replaced by online voting, and that is called electronic voting.
No, we have physical machines.
Of course, that's a very different thing, and that is good for the electoral process as opposed to online voting, which at least in Russian context is an absolute disaster. And coming back to the recent all-nation election day, the elections were mostly on the regional level. A few of the State Duma deputy were re-elected because they went somewhere else and got, for example, positions in the executive. But the main novelty was not the degree of control that we've been used to already. Not even the non-admission of candidates, although, for example, in Moscow, the Moscow City Duma, the Moscow City Parliament was being re-elected, and none of the oppositional candidates from the so-called non-systemic opposition, that is from the non-parliamentary parties, or the self-initiated candidates, not one of them was allowed to even register, to say nothing of running on the ballot. But that is not new again. What is genuinely new is the widespread use of online voting. In Moscow, we are being told that the majority of voters used online methods.
If I might ask you, so how does this online voting work? Do you say that from 8 in the morning till 8 in the evening, the platform will be open? And you just go and you cast your vote, or how does it work?
I voted
And
electronically myself because for self-evident reasons I can't go to a polling station. And since I still want, although I don't much believe in the system, I still want to preserve some sense of connection to the place where I used to live. So I voted. So I can tell you how that works. You can do it from your phone. Yes, it's open during the hours of voting, although there's preliminary voting as well, but you need to register for it. So you go on a certain platform, you need to register through your account, your official account that you use on a state services platform that we all inhabit, and there you can pay your taxes and then pay your fines and order certain state documents. Like many authoritarian instruments, it's extremely convenient. It's one of those things that Russians complain about, the lack thereof, when they go to Europe, because the internet is faster back at home and online banking is way superior to anything you can see.
Same in India.
Yeah, here in Europe.
Like
and
you can pay a vegetable vendor with a QR code.
And online services generally, including state services, are much, much better
But are they reliable?
developed. Well, they are reliable in a sense that, yeah, you can pay your road fine there online in a moment at any time around the clock. But it is also reliable in the sense that it will control you. And, for example, when they send you a summons.
So they can dig up all the history through one search.
Yes, when they send you summons for conscription services
Okay.
or mobilization, then also you can't escape that. And speaking of voting, so you register through your state services account and you go on a separate platform. In case of Moscow, it's a Moscow City platform rather than a federal one. And then you have your ballot and you vote, and then you get to see the sign saying, congratulations, you have voted. And that's it. So you cast your vote in not just in a black box, but in a black chasm.
You don't know where it, like,
You don't
it just
know.
disappears in the
There
black
is,
hole of data.
There is no control. There is no observation that is possible. The person who was the head of independent observers in Russia for many years, he is now in prison.
Why?
Why? For participating in the activity of an undesirable organization. And that is the Observers Union. It's called Golos, the vote or the voice. So, the technical operator of the system of online voting is the FSB, the Federal Security Service. You don't ask questions of them. They ask questions of you if you're unfortunate enough to attract their attention. So there is not even a shadow of civic or parliamentary or public control or whatever. So when this first was tried, and it was tried in some regions of, in some districts of Moscow back in 2019, then it spread around and is now being used in many regions of the country for gubernatorial elections and local legislative elections, also during parliamentary elections, and in Moscow for the regional elections.
But
as well.
does it not lead to creation of fake voters? Because troll farms, fake voters is something that is easy to manufacture.
For that, you need to register your troll on a state services platform, and you need to show a passport.
Okay, so it's not as easy.
Well, it's not as easy if you are just a citizen, but if you are the FSB, then it's much easier. I have heard stories in Moscow, which I cannot, of course, prove, but there are stories that there exists the whole fake multi-apartment houses.
Okay.
Just for the sake of registration and yes, having an address and receiving state subsidies because they come per capita. So the more fake people you create,
so you could have one landowner who owns that building, 15 people living in it, and he could also get state subsidies.
Or rather, not 15, but considering what multi-apartment houses are in Moscow, it's rather 500 people. So it certainly creates many opportunities. But again, the poll says that people like it for being comfortable. And of course, it's comfortable. You don't need to go anywhere. You can vote from the safety of your apartment. There's rather the other side of the problem. We know why autocracies, even fully developed ones like Russian, why they still keep to the electoral procedure rather than just announcing themselves to be national leaders for life. They still have those regular and multi-level electoral events.
Yeah, as you like to call them.
Yes. So we know why they do that. They do that to create an exercise for the voters and for the bureaucracy. For those who are told to show up and demonstrate their loyalty, and also for those who organize the whole process. So you kind of create a sense of unity and shared responsibility for the lower and middle levels of your system by making them participate in, yes, organizing, but also falsifying electoral results. If you move from actual paper votes to this electronic voting, you take away a lot of risks for the system. You don't have to rely on the untrustworthy physical citizens because one never completely knows what they are up to. You can use propaganda on them, you can try to buy them off, you can try to intimidate them, but so long as there's a ballot with at least 2 alternative candidates or alternative parties, you are at the risk. The Soviet regime decided this problem once and forever. These were the non-alternative elections. But if you can do that, you have a degree of uncertainty, which autocracies don't like. But electronic voters are all very well. They are completely trustworthy. They won't play you tricks. They will do exactly as you tell them. But you take away this important loyalty building exercise from your bureaucracy, from those middle-aged women that on every level participate in local electoral commissions, that actually welcome voters to the polling stations, that count the votes and falsify the protocols if necessary. They get paid for it, and they have a sense of commonality as a result. So if you move away from this time-honored practice, how is your loyalty exercise going? So it's
is it also a matter of, kind of emptying the system from within, or rather destroying it from within? Because it seems like a small thing. But then it has implications.
Elections are never a small thing.
No, what I'm saying is, as a measure, it may look like a small thing.
Yes, in the context of the war and political repressions and all kind of things that are happening in the country, yes, it may seem like a small thing to discuss, but it lies at the very heart of the system. It's what is called in Russian folklore the needle with the magician's death at the end.
Okay.
It's a very popular Russian fairy tale. You know, you have this evil magician, he's immortal, because his death is hidden. It's hidden in the end of the needle, and the needle is in the egg, and the egg is in the duck, and the duck is in the hare, and the hare is in the chest, and the chest is buried in an island in the middle of the sea. But the hero goes there with the help of his magic helpers, the animals that he has previously saved, you know the motive. And they get him to the island and dig out the chest and open the chest. And then the hare runs out and another animal chases the hare and rips him open, and then the duck flies away. But you have a bird helper who chases the duck, and then the egg falls out. It falls into the sea, but your friendly fish catches it and brings it to you, and then you break it open and you break the needle. And that's the end. As I said, again, sorry for so many tales, but it's one of those fairy tales which are known to every Russian speaker across the globe. So whenever we are talking about something that, as you said, is in the heart of the system, we are constantly thinking about this death at the needles. And so it's a small thing. Sometimes it's a small thing that is really crucial. But if we are coming back to our subject of subversion of democratic institutions, when we have this really advanced stage of authoritarian consolidation, we don't just see the whole electoral system being twisted to serve the preservation of power, presumably forever. As you said, no one lasts forever, but personalist autocracies, for some reason, tend to forget this highly important circumstance.
It's not just that they forget it, they also want people to forget it. That's the risky part. By controlling narratives.
To present somebody as really immortal.
Yeah. Like when Mr. Modi claims that he is a reincarnation or whatever, he's God sent.
I remember you talked about it.
Yeah, and when you
we are not at that stage yet.
No, but what I'm saying is you kind of make sure that the perception that people have of you is that of being someone who's going to be around. You remember yesterday you spoke about the father figure. So I think the father figure is a beautiful metaphor to describe that, because regardless of if your father is not there or if he's still around, for any child in their heart, the father is always around. And so that sense of he's going to be around, he's there, and he's going to make sure that things run the way they should. And I think that's the narrative. So it's not just the guys changing it for themselves, it's the popular perception that they are working to change.
But for this, again, fairy tale to keep its grasp on people's minds, you have to keep them in really a state of perpetual childhood. Because as we grow up...
as George Orwell did it in 1984 in the book.
Changing the past.
You just rewrite history. You kind of have an entire group of people just rewriting history all the time.
One of the more troubling, well, everything is troubling these days. We hardly get any good news from home. But one of the more troubling bits of news that got my way recently was the declaration of the advisor to the president, who is responsible for education and who, by the way, is the author of our latest version of Russian history textbook. His name is Vladimir Medinsky. I remember him back in the Duma when he was just a press secretary to one of the MPs. Who could have known that he'd grow to such a position? He used to be the Minister of Culture. Now he's advisor to the president, which is, again, in authoritarian environment, it's a more important position sometimes than the position of a minister, because you have the access to the ear of the leader. So what he said is 11 years of schooling is an unallowable luxury. It's too long.
So how long should it be?
He didn't specify. But he said it's like we're living in the 19th century, which is surprising because, of course, the reality is exactly the opposite. When civilization progresses, the term of education gets longer. Back in the 19th century, people who got 3 years of elementary education were lucky because the majority of the population was illiterate, at least in case of Russia. So when you have urbanization and ongoing civilization process, then people start to prolong their childhood for longer and longer because you don't have to start working immediately, and they learn longer, and they have secondary and post-secondary education, and the higher and higher percentage of your population gets more educated. In case of Russia, in terms of the proportion of the people who have education higher than the secondary, we are the third in the world. We are below only Canada and Israel in that respect. So we are, in terms of post-secondary education, the proportion of people who are educated after the school. And when we hear a person with influence on decision-making saying that 11 years is too much, and also that higher education of 5 or 6 years is also too much, we need to shorten it and concentrate it so that people could come earlier to the stage of professional orientation. It's truly terrifying because I understand what they mean. I understand what they want. They want people to become cheaper soldiers faster. They don't want this over-educated population that wouldn't sign contracts with the Minister of Defense so willingly, or if they do, they demand ever-rising payments. So you have to pay for the bodies that you buy. And that doesn't sit comfortable with the authorities. So I don't know if they will come to the 3 years education, or maybe they will allow Russian people a little more time to get their school curriculum. What I'm afraid of also with their insane concentration on the problem of demography and birth rates is that they will come to the same conclusion that the Taliban in Afghanistan came. That once you teach the girls to read and write,
you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Say farewell to high birth rates. So again, 5 years for the boys and 3 years for the girls. And then the first category goes to the army and the second goes to have babies. There's also some contradiction in this idea because if you take all the boys to the army, so who will be making babies back at home? But the whole trend is extremely worrying. Again, it's worse than worrying. It's terrifying. So we'll be watching it in consternation at least. But we need to keep an eye on it and perhaps to do the best in our power to let the world know about what is happening.
And I think kind of building up on what you've been saying, also in terms of what subversions also do to people. So
subversion of democracy is not just subversion of democracy alone.
No.
It starts with this, and then it goes to break apart the very foundations of rational and civilized life.
Yeah, but the foundations of rational and civilized life, as you like to call it, also kind of has a prerequisite that people stop asking questions. People stop feeling a variety of emotions, because the moment you have a variety of emotions like fear, anxiety, happiness, questions, just curiosity, you can't address that if you are,
Well, sometimes you get those emotions and you get those questions too late for them to be
I
of any
wanted
use
to address the
others.
notion of anxiety, because we have been talking about it.
Yes.
In terms of how the levels of anxiety have been steadily increasing, especially in the past few weeks.
They have been
in Russia.
In case of Russia, they have been. It's a fluctuating parameter, so they're going up and down at a rather, I would say, hysterical rate. If you look at, if you look at those lines,
not as a gradual.
Yeah, no, it's not gradual. And that's an interesting thing actually. So if you look at those lines, the level of anxiety or the level of calmness. Again, the question is asked, how are people around you feeling, not what you are feeling.
How you are feeling.
Yeah, that presumably allows the respondents to be more objective and their estimations. But you don't have this gradual, stable, natural line. You have this line which is like, you don't know, the cardiogram of somebody who is having a heart attack. So you have high anxiety levels, and then you have this unnaturally low anxiety levels. Like you're watching a horror movie, you know, when there's some threat and then it doesn't immediately materialize and you feel this surge of euphoria. So when the Kursk incursion started, when Ukrainian armed forces entered the Kursk region, anxiety levels went up. And then in a couple of weeks, they went down again. And the calmness line became higher than the anxiety line.
And now?
Now it's again
on the up.
Yes,
on the rise.
It's again on the rise. So evidently, people got the idea that the authorities will sort that out. But the moment they achieved this comforting sensation, something started to worry them again. Either it's the fact that this whole Kursk story is dragging on, and the Ukrainians are still there, and they're even gaining territory. We are told that in exchange, Russian forces are gaining territory in Donbass, in Donetsk region, but that doesn't seem to impress the Russian audiences that much, because Kursk is, well, our own traditional territory, and Donbass is a new acquisition, and it has various perceptions among the Russian respondents. But the anxiety levels may be up again because of the prolongation of this whole situation, as it is called in official language, but also the whole talk about nuclear threat may add to the current state of mind.
So you're still watching it,
Russians.
How the anxiety levels rise?
Of course, I'm watching it every week. The Foundation of Public Opinion are publishing these results
Is your anxiety
Friday.
rising with that?
Well, again, coming back to the beginning of our conversation, when you are both the culinary critic and the ingredient in the soup, you better switch to your culinary critic persona, because that helps you
have some distance.
Yes, have some distance, and to be in control at least of the things you are analyzing in your headspace. And that is what we can do. Many things do not
have
depend
the
on us.
objectivity.
Yes.
Or at least have the assumption that you are objective.
At least strive to be as objective and scientifically reasonable as is quite possible. And this is our ambition, also within the limits of this hour, again, hopefully regular conversation.
Yes, I think that's something that we have to like strive for, because we've been traveling, both of us.
Yes, we are both traveling a lot, and I'll be traveling for the next at least couple of weeks.
Yeah.
But
maybe some of the people will have a chance to see you in the US.
Yes.
If they're around.
I'll be having public lectures in like 6 cities in the United States, where I hope to reach, of course, Russian-speaking audiences, but also American-speaking audiences over there, across the pond.
English audiences as well.
Yes. Next week I'll be in London, and we'll be having status program from London, from the hall with live audience in London. And again, for those of you who are interested in listening to this Russian-India discussion in the brand of English that we're using, and also enjoying the different types of accents that we're delivering, please, again, listen and subscribe, and that will be an incentive for us to keep to the schedule and have those conversations regularly.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back soon, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Thank you.
We promise. Thank you.